In the spring of 1220, on the edge of the ancient land of Khwarezm, where the desert light burns so white it erases the horizon, a girl named Zarya was taken from her mother. The soldiers came at dawn, their horses moving in silence, their faces wrapped in cloth against the dust. There were no speeches, no shouts, only the sound of hooves and the dull creak of leather straps as the soldiers pulled her away. Zarya was 14. Her mother had whispered her name only once that morning, so softly that even the wind might not hear it. But the girl did. She would carry that sound, that final whisper, longer than any memory of the sky above her village, or the scent of bread cooling in the clay oven. The Mongol soldiers did not strike her. They did not need to. Their calmness was worse than cruelty. Around her neck they tied a strip of dyed wool, the mark of classification, red for reproductive age. Beside her marched women older than her mother, faces blank, eyes rimmed in salt. Behind them, carts rolled across the plain, iron-banded wheels grinding over the bones of what had once been fields. There was a smell to this new world, smoke, sweat, and iron, the odour of empire. When Zarya's mother collapsed to the ground, the soldier standing nearest her simply turned his horse away. He had done this 100 times. The Mongols did not waste emotion on grief. They had systematized it. Every captured woman was recorded. Age, height, hair colour, body type. Scrolls filled with data written by scribes who followed behind the troops like accountants of flesh. To the Empire, Zarya was no longer a daughter. She was a number, a unit of potential, a future vessel. It is tempting to imagine her story as a single tragedy, a brutal episode lost in the vastness of conquest. But it was not an accident. It was design. A policy refined through observation, shaped by necessity and elevated to doctrine. The Mongols had discovered something their enemies had not, that control of the womb was more enduring than control of land. A city could rebel, a border could shift, but a generation born of both conqueror and conquered would never forget who ruled their mothers. Zarya's capture was one line in an immense ledger that stretched across continents. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the orchards of Samarkand, the empire was redrawing the map of humanity not through treaties or temples, but through bloodlines. In the caravan that day, hundreds walked in silence. The youngest wept without sound. The oldest stared ahead with the stillness of statues. They were not chained, not beaten, not burned, and yet they were enslaved all the same. Their bodies were their prisons. A Mongol officer rode beside them, eyes scanning the line with the dispassionate gaze of an overseer. On the parchment in his saddlebag was a list, a precise inventory, 212 women, categorized by fertility and health, assigned to specific units of the advancing army. To him, Zarya was the 14th name. Her village had been erased before sunset. That night, as the caravan camped beneath a sky put so vast it seemed to swallow the earth, the girls huddled close for warmth. No one spoke of escape. They knew what happened to those who tried. But one woman older, with hands scarred from the plough, began to hum. A lullaby, ancient, trembling, forbidden. Zarya didn't understand the words, but she understood the defiance in them. For the Mongols, every empire began with a census. They counted everything: horses, arrows, prisoners, wombs. Their brilliance was not merely in conquest, but in what came after. They transformed chaos into order. They converted grief into ledger entries. To the West, they would be remembered as destroyers. To themselves, they were engineers, designers of a world reborn through control. Zarya's tears dried in the cold wind as the caravan moved again at dawn. In the distance, the mountains glowed pale and indifferent. Somewhere beyond them, men with titles and maps called this expansion destiny. But destiny has a sound: the muffled footsteps of captives in sand, the rustle of parchment, the scratching of ink that turns lives into numbers. This is how an empire begins, not with a shout, but with the quiet of a scribe's pen. What Genghis Khan built was more than a military machine. It was a system of reproduction, a network that reached into the most private chambers of humanity. Power was no longer about territory, it was about biology. And so the story of one girl on a dusty morning in 1220 becomes something far greater. Her silence, her endurance, her transformation from name to number, these were not aberrations, they were the blueprint. For the Mongols had learned that the surest conquest was not of the sword, but of the womb. Zarya's footsteps fade into the desert wind, but the system that claimed her is only beginning to take shape. Long before his name became a psalm whispered across continents, there was only a boy called Temujin. He was born in 1162 near the Onon River, a place of harsh beauty, where the grass never grew high enough to hide the bones. The Mongolian steppe was not the wide green serenity painted by later poets. It was a battlefield of survival summers, of blazing wind and dust winters, so cold that even wolves starved mid-hunt. Here the horizon was both promise and punishment. The sky offered endless freedom, but the earth gave nothing without blood. Children learned early that the weak did not endure. When snow buried the plains, families boiled leather for broth, scraped lichen from stones, and fought over the marrow of frozen carcasses. In this landscape, mercy was not a virtue, it was a liability. Temujin's clan, the Borjigin, was small and often hunted by larger tribes. His father Yesugei was a minor chieftain, respected for his courage but feared for his temper. Power on the steppe was measured not by land, there was too much of it, but by loyalty and horses. A man was nothing without followers, and followers remained only while they were fed. When Temujin was 9, his father arranged a marriage alliance with a neighbouring tribe and brought the boy to meet his future bride Berta. It was meant to secure peace, a promise sealed in fermented mare's milk, and oaths spoken beneath an open sky. But on the journey home, Yesugei accepted hospitality from a rival clan, unaware that the drink they offered was poisoned. He died before nightfall. In an instant, the fragile web that held Temujin's world together snapped. The tribe, unwilling to feed a widow and her children, abandoned them. The family was left to die among the river reeds. That first winter carved the boy's soul into something hard and enduring. His mother Hurlen taught them to snare fish with bare hands, to boil bones until they crumbled. She told them that tears wasted water and water was life. Every lesson was written in hunger. Among the steppe peoples there was no written law, only custom. One such law was Ander the blood oath. 2 men could become brothers by mingling their blood in ritual. Betraying that bond was worse than murder. Yet Temujin learned quickly that oaths broke as easily as ice under a horse's hoof when food grew scarce. The boy watched how alliances formed and dissolved like frost. Chiefs raided one another not for glory but for survival. A single storm could erase a herd and with it a family's future. So they took from others before others took from them. In that cold arithmetic of existence, compassion was a luxury that no one could afford. Temujin grew into adolescence with eyes that saw patterns where others saw chaos. He noticed that the strongest men often fell because they trusted pride more than structure. Power that relied on fear scattered when its owner died. What survived was discipline rules, loyalty reward. He began to imagine a world where the steppe could be unified not through endless raids but through order. But unity required control, and control required understanding what men and women feared most: hunger, loneliness, dishonour. When the Teters captured him years later, they bound his neck in a wooden collar so heavy he could not lift his head. Other boys might have broken. Temujin endured. He watched his captors' routines, their hierarchies, their petty cruelties. Even in chains he studied power like a scholar studies scripture. One night during a thunderstorm he escaped with the help of a sympathetic servant. The memory of that risk, the chance taken by one nameless mountain, taught him something profound: loyalty could be bought not only with gold or blood but with justice. From then on he vowed that those who served him faithfully would be rewarded no matter their birth. It was a radical thought in a world where lineage was law. As he gathered followers in the years to come, he replaced noble titles with merit, replacing tribal feuds with the new code of honour Yasa. It demanded obedience but promised protection. Theft, betrayal and cowardice were punished by death, but within its iron grip even the poor could rise. The steppe had raised him without pity. Every famine, every betrayal had become a teacher. The cold had burned weakness out of him, leaving something elemental like iron formed in fire. The Mongols of his generation spoke of destiny as wind, unseen, unstoppable, cruel. Temujin became the wind's embodiment. Yet beneath the legend's armour lay the memory of a boy crouched beside a frozen river, sharing a single fish with his brothers, watching the stars shiver above him. He understood something no conqueror before him had grasped, that survival itself could be organised. The future empire was already stirring inside him, not as ambition, but as hunger refined into method. In a land that devoured the weak, Temujin learned the only law worth keeping to endure is to rule. And from endurance would come a system that would one day feed on the bodies and bloodlines of millions. The steppe had given him its first gift, the knowledge that compassion could be postponed, but order could not. The boy who had once starved beside the Onon River would grow into the man who taught the world how to weaponize scarcity. The wind on the steppe carries everything: smoke, dust, songs and screams. In the summer of 1178, when Temujin was 16, that wind brought him his first great loss. Berta, his promised wife, was taken. It began as so many step tales did, with hospitality that turned to treachery. Temujin had married her only months before, uniting two small clans with a modest dowry, a sable coat so fine that even a Khan might envy it. The marriage was simple, no temples, no priests. Under the open sky they shared fermented mare's milk and joined their hands beneath the eternal blue heaven, witnessed by kin and herds. For the Mongols, marriage was less a sacrament than a social treaty. A wife was not only companion but symbol, her family's blood woven into her husband's tribe. But the steppe had its older, darker customs too. Among them was alakachu, bride capture, sometimes ritualized, sometimes real. In peaceful times it was symbolic, the groomsmen stealing the bride to prove his strength. In war it was literal theft sanctioned by chaos. Temujin's new union had angered the Merkits, a rival tribe with whom his father had once stolen a woman, Temujin's own mother. To them this marriage was a debt unpaid. So when the opportunity came, they struck. One night as the camp slept, Merkit riders descended like ghosts through the grass. They took Berta and vanished into the dark. When Temujin awoke to the empty place beside him, the silence was unbearable. There are moments that divide a man's life into before and after, and this was his. He gathered what few allies he had, his blood brother Jamuka, once his closest friend, and Togrul, the Karaite chief, who had been his father's ally. Together they rode north, following the trail of hooves and rumour. Days turned to weeks. He barely slept, barely ate. The hunt was not only for Berta, but for meaning. Each village he passed whispered new details, a young woman bound taken through the river valleys, hidden among the tents of the Merkits. Temujin's face hardened into something no longer boyish. He had seen his tribe betray his mother. Now he saw history repeating itself through his wife. The Mongol world had always treated women as property of alliances, yet paradoxically they wielded quiet power. A wife managed the camp, distributed food, commanded servants, and could influence the loyalty of men. Temujin understood this better than most. Berta was not only his heart, she was his future. Without her, his legitimacy as a leader faltered. When he finally found her, she was alive but changed. She had been passed among her captors as spoil. Her hair was matted, her voice a whisper, and she was pregnant. In the lore of the steppe, such things were accepted with a grim shrug. To Temujin, it was revelation. The violation of Berta was not just a personal wound, it was an education in power. He saw that the womb was not sacred ground, it was territory the most contested of all. When Berta gave birth, the child's paternity was uncertain. Temujin named him Jochi the Guest. It was both acknowledgement and denial, love and suspicion bound in a single word. Some said he never fully trusted the boy. Others said he saw in Jochi the embodiment of the steppe's brutal logic, a child born of conquest, heir to both violence and endurance. But the deeper transformation took place within Temujin himself. Berta's abduction taught him that control over women's bodies was not just revenge, it was a form of governance. If tribes could be merged through marriage and blood, then wombs could be turned into weapons. From that wound, an idea began to take shape, the empire could breed its way into permanence. Yet before the vision, there was still love. He did not discard Berta as others might have. He protected her, honoured her status as his chief wife. In private, they shared the same silence that had once bound them in youth. Theirs was not tenderness, as the world knows it, but alliance forged by endurance. To outsiders, this might seem cruelty. To the Mongols, it was devotion. Berta became the matriarch of his growing household, overseeing herds, managing camp logistics, and advising him on clan politics. She endured humiliation and transformed it into structure. And Temujin never forgot. The memory of her abduction burned inside him like an unhealed wound. It taught him two laws: that security must be absolute and that fear must be organized. He began to build a network of alliances, not through kinship, but through loyalty enforced by oath. He divided spoils with precision, forbade arbitrary seizure of women among his followers, and claimed first rights over captives. To his men, this was reward. To historians, it was the foundation of control. When later he looked upon conquered cities, he did not see women as casualties, he saw them as conduits of assimilation. Berta's ordeal had shown him that identity could be rewritten in the womb. What she suffered became the model for empire. In this sense, Berta was not only the mother of his children, but of his system. Her body became the first map upon which he drew his theory of dominion, one that would one day stretch from the Pacific to the Danube. He would take what had been done to her and turn it into a weapon so vast that entire nations would bear its scar. And yet amid the roar of future conquests, a quieter truth endured. Every empire begins in an intimate room, in a bed, in a cry, in a betrayal. Berta's abduction was not the beginning of Genghis Khan's power, but the moment his heart learned what conquest truly meant, not possession of land, but the rearrangement of life itself. The woman who returned to his camp was both beloved and symbol proof that love could survive violation and that violation could become doctrine. From that night on, the boy who had once chased his stolen bride would chase the world instead. The steppe had always been a graveyard of empires. The Chinese called it the land of ghosts, and wind too vast to rule, too empty to feed, too wild to hold. Yet among its shifting alliances and endless wars, one man began to see a pattern, where others saw only chaos. By the mid-1190s, Temujin was no longer just a survivor. He was a strategist. He had lived through betrayal, hunger and exile, and he had learned something from each. In a world where tribes rose and fell like the tide, he began to understand that real conquest required more than swords. It required structure. He rode across burned plains after raids and noticed a pattern his rivals ignored. Men died, but women endured. After every massacre, after every torchlit plundering, there remained those who kept the fires alive, buried the dead, gathered. The children mended what could be mended. The men vanished into smoke, but the women kept the tribe breathing. To Temujin, this was revelation. The future of any people was carried in its women. Control them, protect them, design them, and you controlled destiny itself. Fertility was not a domestic matter, it was governance. His vision of power was therefore both brutal and mathematical. He divided captured populations with deliberate logic. Women of conquered tribes were distributed not as spoils, but as tools of integration. Marriage became a political technology. He encouraged his warriors to marry women from other tribes, forcing old enemies to share blood. Within a single generation, ancient feuds dissolved in the cradle. Temujin began to draft rules oral at first, then later inscribed in memory by his secretaries that redefined how a nomadic empire could function. He forbade the arbitrary theft of women within his ranks, replacing chaos with hierarchy. No woman could be taken without the Khan's sanction. On the surface, this was moral reform. In practice, it centralized reproductive control under one authority, his. His early administrative reforms followed the same principle of absorption. Every tribe he conquered was catalogued. Horses, tents, smiths, archers, herds, women all counted. The Mongols had no written census yet, but Temujin's mind worked like one. He remembered faces, family ties, blood debts. He assigned officers not by birth, but by loyalty, introducing units of 10,000 a military grid that could be moved like pieces on a board. He transformed the loose kinship of the steppe into a mechanical order. Where other Khans ruled through charisma and plunder, Temujin ruled through memory and method. The Yasa, his evolving code, was the spine of this system. It was both law and scripture merging justice with logistics. It punished theft, rewarded obedience, and forbade disputes over captured women without permission. It was the beginning of a bureaucracy where emotion was replaced by protocol. When raids ended, he studied their aftermaths like a physician examining a wound. He observed which settlements repopulated fastest, which lines of kinship revived most easily, which children adapted quickest to new masters. He concluded that birth was the empire's truest weapon. Swords won battles, wombs won centuries. Around his growing camp gathered men who sensed that something new was forming a network of loyalty that felt less like a tribe and more like a system. Old titles vanished. Even aristocrats from rival clans submitted, drawn by the strange fairness of Temujin's rule. He rewarded merit. A herdsman who fought bravely might command 100. A blacksmith who produced good iron could dine beside princes. But beneath this meritocracy lay calculation. By binding men through reward and their wives through marriage, he built chains stronger than iron chains of kinship and dependence that stretched across the steppe. His own household became the prototype of empire, multiple wives from various tribes, each representing an alliance. Berta remained the first and highest, but others followed each marriage less about love than integration. Every birth tied another family, another tribe, another future to him. Temujin's tent became a government before the word existed. Scribes recorded births and deaths. Messengers carried orders written on bark or bone. Herds were tagged and counted. Even livestock were redistributed according to loyalty, an early welfare system disguised as military reward. Yet beneath the order pulsed the same vision that had haunted him since Berta's abduction: life must be organized or it will be stolen. By 1204 most of the Mongol tribes had bent to him willingly or not. The Tartars, the Nayman, the Karit all crushed or absorbed. The steppe's endless cycle of vengeance began to slow. Where once raids ended in slaughter, now they ended in census. The chaos that had orphaned him was finally yielding to a grim, deliberate peace. In the spring of 1206, beside the sacred Onon River, a great assembly was called. Tens of thousands gathered, chiefs, warriors, women, slaves. The air was alive with dust and chanting. Beneath a banner of 9 white yak tails, Temujin rose from his saddle. There was no crown, no golden throne, only the sound of wind moving through the grass. The elders lifted him upon their shoulders, and the title was proclaimed, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The boy who had once been left to starve was now the axis, around which the world would turn. As the crowd shouted his name, he looked across the steppe, not with triumph, but with calculation. For him, the coronation was not an ending, but the beginning of a great experiment. He had united the tribes through loyalty and fear. Now he would unite the world through biology and order. In his mind, the steppe itself was a womb, vast, fertile, and ready to be seeded with his design. That day, the age of tribes ended, the age of systems began, and from the cold logic of one man's survival was born the most efficient engine of domination the world had ever seen. The year was 1209. Genghis Khan's empire was still young, but his system, his machinery of order was ready for its first great test. His armies turned west toward the kingdom of the Tangut, a rich oasis civilization lying between the desert of Gobi and the mountains of Helen. The Tangut called their land Xia, the Western Xia dynasty. To the Mongols it was simply the gate to the world. The Tangut were traders and scholars, guardians of the Silk Road that carried silk, jade and silver from China to Persia. Their cities glowed with painted tiles and prayer flags, irrigated gardens, and Buddhist temples, a fragile island of civilization surrounded by emptiness. But to Genghis they were more than a target. They were a laboratory. He did not come merely to plunder. He came to test a hypothesis. The campaign began with silence. Mongol scouts mapped every water source and pasture before the main army moved. No raiding, no chaos, only precision. When the Mongols struck, it was as if a single organism had awakened. They advanced like a tide, dividing the land into zones of use. Warriors in front, administrators behind, and behind them something new, caravans of physicians, scribes and women. The Tangut chroniclers, who survived only in fragments, recorded their disbelief. They came with beasts and tents, but also with record keepers, one wrote. Even in war they carried scrolls. Another called them men who count the living and the dead with equal calm. For Genghis Khan, the war against the Tangut was not simply conquest. It was the first controlled experiment in human management. As cities fell, Wulahai Zhongxing and others, his officers conducted systematic tallies. They recorded livestock, crops, craftsmen, and most chillingly women. They categorized them by age, fertility, and lineage, marking wrists with dye or brands for identification. These lists would later be copied and stored, becoming templates for future campaigns. From the Tangut campaign onward, every Mongol invasion would carry with it not only soldiers but recorders. The pen and the sword marched side by side. The Tangut prisoners were divided into caravans organized like supply units. Some were tasked to carry provisions, others more carefully selected were placed in guarded wagons, proto-administrative biological divisions as later scholars would call them. Women of reproductive age were segregated, fed special diets and examined by Mongol physicians. These physicians, trained in a blend of steppe herbalism and Chinese medicine, were instructed to preserve capacity, meaning fertility. The Mongols had long used herbs to regulate livestock breeding, and now they applied those same methods to people. The Tangut campaign saw the first known human applications of these techniques. They fed women mixtures of wild garlic and fermented mare's milk to keep the blood warm. They used powdered bone of stallions as tonic. They tested crude methods to accelerate conception, noting results on bark slivers tied to wagon poles. To them, this was not cruelty but efficiency. From surviving Tangut court accounts translated centuries later, we know the horror this caused. A monk from the monastery of Lingwu wrote that the Mongols herded the mothers apart like cattle, giving them new names written on wood. Some cried out to the bodhisattva to be reborn as men, for women had become harvest fields. This was the birth of the empire as reproductive bureaucracy. Temujin's genius was that he saw reproduction as both resource and resistance. In older nomadic wars, women had been trophies. In his system, they became infrastructure. The caravans following his armies were not just columns of slaves, they were mobile laboratories of assimilation. Each caravan had its own command structure, a captain, a scribe, a physician, and guards. Daily logs recorded not just distances and deaths, but menstrual cycles, pregnancies and births. Infants were tagged with leather tokens indicating origin and potential placement. Those with Mongol features, broad cheekbones, darker hair were marked as promising stock. The efficiency was horrifying. In some caravans, half of all captives perished from exhaustion or infection. The Mongol records mention these deaths not as tragedies but as logistical failures. Every life was an entry in an account book. When the Tangut court finally sued for peace, they sent an envoy offering tribute gold horses and a royal marriage. Genghis accepted, but on his terms. The Tangut princess he received would join his expanding household, her lineage folded into his own bloodline. Her body became a treaty. The kingdom survived technically, but not unchanged. Tangut men were conscripted as labourers. Tangut women became the first wave of what the empire called seeded peoples. To the Tangut chroniclers it was annihilation disguised as administration. To the Mongols it was order imposed upon chaos. One captured scribe recorded the moment with chilling simplicity. They built no monuments, they built records. In that first campaign the pattern of all future conquests was set. War would no longer end with victory, it would continue in the quiet months after, in the camps, in the caravans, in the wombs. The Tangut experiment proved that populations could be transformed faster through biology than through belief. For Genghis Khan, this was confirmation that the empire's greatest weapon was not fire, but fertility. Years later, when his sons expanded the empire westward, the techniques refined during this campaign would become standard protocol. Spies and scribes would precede soldiers cataloguing women before the battles even began. It was here on Tangut soil that the logic of efficiency fused with the logic of atrocity, where birth became conquest and conquest became arithmetic. The fields of Yi-Xia would never recover. The monasteries burned their libraries ash. Yet among the ruins the Mongols left something far more enduring than death a method. Order perfect and merciless had been born, and in that order lay the quiet horror of empire the moment humanity was replaced by record-keeping and compassion by design. After the Tangut experiment, Genghis Khan's armies no longer marched as raiders, they advanced as administrators. Every victory was followed by an audit. Soldiers plundered, but scribes organized. And from those scrolls emerged the most chilling invention of the Mongol system, the classification of human bodies. It was not called that, of course. The Mongols had no single word for it. Yet across the ledgers that followed the army from the Gobi to the Yellow River, 3 markings began to appear beside women's names, or more often beside their numbers. They were written in brushstrokes as simple as they were cruelty. The first meant primary reproducer women aged roughly 14 to 30, strong unscarred, of useful form. These women were the empire's most valuable resource. They were fed better, watched closely, and sent to designated camps for integration. The second secondary reproducer referred to those between 31 and 40, often mothers already. Their role was transitional, some to bear, others to train the younger captives in domestic discipline. The third mark X meant discard. Too old, too young, too sick. Their bodies were used until exhaustion or death. Some became servants, others simply vanished into the dust. This system, the taxonomy of flesh, was not unique and in history. The Assyrians had once mastered deportation as social engineering, scattering conquered peoples across provinces to erase identity. The Romans had catalogued slaves by skilled scribes, builders, wet nurses, concubines. But where earlier empires managed labour, the Mongols managed lineage. Their innovation was not just enslavement, it was replication. For the first time, an empire's survival was written not on maps, but in bloodlines. The bureaucrats who tallied these bodies were not monsters in the way legends suggest. They were functionaries, often educated men who saw themselves as the keepers of order. To them, the categories were a kind of mercy, a rational system to minimize waste, to make chaos calculable. They believed they were civilizing war. Imagine one of them, a clerk named Kassar, his hands ink-stained, his eyes dry from sand. Each evening he sits by the fire copying lists by lamplight. The wind rattles the parchment as he writes 2 widowed 2 sons. He does not look up when he hears weeping. He has learned that empathy slows the hand. And beyond the circle of firelight, the people he writes about live out their new designations. A girl of 15, tagged with red dye on her wrist, sits among others in a wagon that smells of milk and iron. She whispers the name of her village to herself again and again so she will not forget it. The guard beside her doesn't hear or pretends not to. In another camp, an older woman, category 2, teaches a younger one how to gather snow in hides to melt for water. They share a crust of frozen curd, pretending it is bread. At night, she tells the girl that she once saw the sea, though perhaps that memory now belongs to someone else, and in the farthest tent a woman marked with the black X wakes before dawn and walks to the edge of the camp. There she buries a small carved bone, her child's name etched into it. She covers it with sand, presses her hand flat and whispers, "Remember me." The categories were efficient. They were also irreversible. Once branded or died, there was no return. Identification was not only physical, it became internal. Many captives began referring to themselves by number. One Tangut woman captured and recorded as Primary 76 left behind a scrap of cloth where she had stitched that number beside her real name, perhaps as an act of defiance, perhaps as resignation. The system's coldness disguised a dark insight. People adapt to labels more quickly than to freedom. Genghis Khan had intuited what later ages would codify: when you define a human as function, the spirit begins to conform. The Mongols used their categories to control reproduction, with the same precision they applied to cavalry formations. Primary reproducers were rotated among camps to ensure genetic mixing. Secondary groups managed infant survival. Women who bore children resembling the Mongol type, broad faces, stocky limbs, darker eyes were elevated, sometimes married to low-ranking officers. Those whose babies looked foreign were quietly reassigned. What began as cruelty became culture. Centuries later, historians would marvel at the empire's administrative efficiency, its postal system, its census, its meritocratic laws, but hidden beneath those praises lay the unrecorded truth that its foundation was built on a ledger of bodies. And yet even within the machinery, sparks of defiance flickered. Some primary women secretly aborted using sharpened bone fragments or bitter herbs smuggled from healers. Secondary women taught the others how to fake illness to avoid selection. A few X-marked women escaped during blizzards, leaving barefoot tracks across the ice. None are recorded as surviving, but their disappearance itself was a form of victory, a crack in the system's perfection. The Mongols measured empire by compliance. The women measured humanity by memory. When Genghis Khan's administrators reviewed their tallies at the campaign's end, they wrote with satisfaction, "From this province, 8 to 200 useful fertile females, 2,000 not usable." It was the language of accounting, not murder. The logic of empire had stripped even the act of atrocity of emotion. To them, the system was proof that chaos could be conquered by classification. To us, it is proof of how far rationality can descend when it forgets compassion. Across history, the impulse repeats. From Assyria's deported captives to Rome's branded slaves, from colonial registers to modern data fields, the same shadow lingers: the belief that order justifies cruelty. The Mongols did not invent it, they perfected it. And in their wake, the categories of flesh remained long after the bones had turned to dust, long after the scrolls had crumbled, long after the world had forgotten the names. They were called kuk-ureg, in whispered tones the blue caravans. To the Mongols, they were inventory. To the women inside them, they were purgatory on wheels. Behind every Mongol army stretching for miles across the steppe came a second silent force, the caravans of captivity. They were not soldiers, yet they moved in formation. They did not fight, yet their existence sustained the war. These rolling encampments, half prison, half factory, followed the great host from one conquest to the next, an unending migration of the conquered. Each caravan was a world of its own, a mobile city without walls. At its head rode officers and scribes. Behind them came the wagons, hundreds of them, covered with stitched felt and bound with rawhide rope. They creaked like ships at sea. Inside, women sat pressed together, breathing the same dust, their wrists still marked with dye or brands. Infants wailed until their voices broke, then fell silent. The Mongols designed everything for motion. They followed the seasons, north in summer, south in winter, so that horses would never lack pasture. The caravans moved accordingly, synchronized with the rhythms of the army. By day, the women saw only the dust kicked up by hooves ahead. By night, the sky was their only roof. Guards rode the flanks, rotating every 12 hours. They were under strict orders: no theft, no unsanctioned violence, no delay. The efficiency was astonishing. At each stop, the officers tallied numbers: who had died, who had given birth, who had been reassigned. It was bureaucracy in motion, the empire's living ledger. In the larger caravans, there were field tents designated for medical purposes. Mongol physicians and midwives, many themselves captives from China or Persia, worked under military supervision. They brewed herbal infusions from wild steppe plants, ephedra, to ease labour pains, juniper to fight infection, goat's milk boiled with mare's blood to restore strength. Every vial, every route was log-tested, compared. It was the steppes version of science, cold, empirical, indifferent to suffering. One Persian chronicler writing years later called these convoys the shadow armies of the Khan. They marched without banners or drums, he wrote, but wherever they passed, nations vanished and new ones began. The paradox was unbearable. The Mongols' empire thrived on precision, yet that precision served despair. Even their compassion was calculated. Mothers who gave birth on the road were allowed 2 days of rest before being moved again. Infants too weak to survive were buried quickly, often without ceremony, their graves marked only by horse bones. The caravan never stopped long enough for mourning. Still life found ways to exist inside the machinery. Women shared stories at night, voices hushed beneath the wind. They braided each other's hair, hiding small keepsakes, buttons, bone pendants, locks of hair woven into the strands. They taught one another fragments of language, a Tangut word for moon, a Persian one for hope, and sometimes in the blue hours before dawn they sang. The songs were unlike any known to the Mongols, soft, wordless laments that carried across the plain. Guards did not forbid it. Some even listened. The melodies had no translation, but they carried memory. Each note was a place left behind a child, a name. The sound rose like smoke and drifted over the camp, fading into the endless horizon. The caravans followed the same routes as the army's couriers along the Kerguelen River toward the Altai, down through the valleys of the Ili across the black sands of the Gobi. They left behind a trail of broken wagon wheels, empty cradles and bones half buried by shifting dunes. When supplies ran low, the weaker were culled. Food and milk were rationed according to category primary-secondary discard. The logic was simple. Those deemed fertile were worth more to the empire alive. At times, blizzards buried entire caravans. Frozen bodies were found months later still sitting upright in their wagons, hair stiff with ice infants clutched to their chests. The Mongols recorded these losses like losses of livestock. 17 conveyances perished in snowstorm winter of the Rabbit, one scribe wrote. Replacements to be acquired from the western provinces. Even the act of death became administrative, and yet amid the horror fragments of humanity persisted. One woman from Zhongxing, known only as Yellen, was said to have carried a small pouch of earth from her garden. Each time the caravan stopped, she sprinkled a handful on the ground before her wagon and whispered a prayer. When she died, her companions buried the pouch with her. Centuries later, archaeologists would find its soil from the Tangut heartland resting far to the west near the Oxus River. It was proof that even when nations were erased, the earth remembered. To the Mongols, the caravans were triumphs of logistics. They demonstrated control over the most unpredictable resource of all people. To the captives, they were purgatories on wheels, where days blurred into seasons and seasons into years. The empire called them mobile populations. The women called them the moving graves. And still they moved endless and obedient, carrying not just bodies but futures. Every step forward left silence behind. The wind erased their footprints, but not the pattern. Wherever the Mongols went, these shadow armies followed living testaments to the empire's paradox order, so perfect it made despair eternal. By 1211, Genghis Khan had turned his gaze eastward, beyond the grasslands past the Great Wall that shimmered. Like a scar across the earth lay the Jin Empire, one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated civilizations of its age. Its cities gleamed with lacquered gates and scholar officials in silk, its ledgers filled with tax codes, land registers, and birth records. To the Mongols, it was the heart of civilization. To Genghis, it was the perfect specimen to dissect. For 2 years, the war against the Jin would transform from conquest into something colder, something methodical. If Shishir had been the experiment, Jin was the industrial application. The Mongols had studied their enemy long before crossing the border. Spies, many of them captured merchants or coerced monks, reported how the Jin managed population censuses, land surveys, household quotas. Genghis admired it. He saw in the Jin's bureaucracy a mirror of his own mind order, but born of paper rather than instinct. He would not destroy it. He would replace it with something leaner, more biological, more permanent. When the Mongol armies swept through the passes of Shanxi and Hebei, they came not only with bows and torches, but with scribes and midwives, physicians and statisticians. It was an army of conquerors and accountants. Cities like Zhongdu, modern Beijing, Taiyuan, and Datong fell in waves, their walls collapsing, not just under arrows, but under calculation. The Mongols no longer measured victory in loot. They measured it in bodies. Each captured city was treated like a dissected organism. Men were divided by tradesmiths, masons, carpenters, scribes. Children were sorted by strength and agility destined for labor camps or assimilation schools, but the women, always the women, were catalogued with surgical precision. Contemporary Chinese chronicles describe the horror with bureaucratic clarity. Of those taken, one record states, those between the ages of 14 and 30 were separated and numbered. Those of beauty or noble family were taken for the officers. The remainder were assigned to the herds. For the Mongols, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. They had learned from the Tangut campaign that unorganized capture wasted potential. Now every city was processed like a human archive. Scrolls were filled with the names or numbers of tens of thousands. Scribes travelled with inkstone and reed, recording fertility, health and lineage. Each entry carried a mark, usable, non-usable or transitory. In the Jin capital of Zhongdu, one surviving fragment of a local record gives a haunting glimpse of the process. The barbarians entered the south gate at dawn. By nightfall the streets were silent. Women gathered in the granary yard were lined by height. Infants were taken. Those who resisted were marked with the knife. The Mongols saw no contradiction between violence and system. Their pragmatism was absolute. The same warriors who unleashed fire on the city 1 hour could calmly oversee a census the next. And yet the contrast between the two worlds, the Jin's ornate urban bureaucracy and the Mongols' austere order, was stark. The Jin had ruled through documents, registries, seals, permits. Their empire functioned through walls, walls of cities, walls of hierarchy, walls of etiquette. The Mongols ruled through movement. They burned the walls, scattered the people, and then rebuilt a new kind of structure inside them, one made of flesh, not stone. To the Jin, the body was a metaphor for the state. To Genghis, the body was the state. He replaced the bureaucrat's brush with the midwife's hand. Census became anatomy. Conquest became reproduction. The system expanded. Caravans now included specialists tasked with tracking pregnancies and births among captives. Reports flowed upward like military dispatches, numbers conceived, numbers delivered, numbers lost. A woman's value was no longer measured by beauty, but by fecundity. Those who bore healthy children were promoted to better rations. Those who miscarried too often were reassigned or discarded. In one chilling passage from a Persian chronicler, it is said that the Khan's officers wrote of the womb as a field and of the child as harvest. The Mongols were no longer only conquerors, they were farmers of humanity. Even the instruments of their rule reflected this new logic. In the Jin capital, the Mongols repurposed the granaries into holding centres for women and children. In the counting halls, where once clerks had tallied tax grain, new clerks now tallied births. The state that had once collected rice now collected people. The Mongols' genius and their horror lay in how seamlessly they absorbed their enemies' certain systems. They took the Jin bureaucracy's meticulous record-keeping and replaced its moral foundation. Where the Jin sought harmony, the Mongols sought control. Where the Jin prized family lineage, the Mongols dissolved it. They tore apart kinship and rewove it under a single-named Khan. As the campaign dragged on, whole populations vanished into the machinery. The roads east of Datong were lined with wagon tracks that no wind could erase. Behind every battlefront stretched the same silent caravans, women marked, with ink children sorted like grain. To the Mongols, the process was proof of divine favour. Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, had chosen them to bring order to a chaotic world. To the conquered, it was an apocalypse written in ledgers. When Zhongdu finally fell in 1213, the sky above the burning city turned red. Genghis Khan watched from a hill as his officers presented him with scrolls listing captives. Tens of thousands of names or numbers rolled out before him like the horizon itself. He did not smile. He simply nodded and said, "The world is wider now." That phrase, recorded by a Persian observer, would echo through the centuries. It was not triumph, it was inventory. The anatomy of power was complete. For the first time, empire had become a living organism, its arteries made of caravans, its blood the people it consumed. Conquest had become administration of the body, and the body, every body, was now the empire's to command. In the years following the fall of Zhongdu, the Mongol machine perfected its cruelest instrument, not the sword, but submission. The empire had already mastered the cataloguing of bodies. Now it turned to mastering the mind. Those who refused to obey were not simply punished, they were reprogrammed. In the camps that trailed the army, resistance took many forms. Some women refused food, Others tried to starve themselves, believing that death was the only act of freedom left. Mothers killed their infants rather than let them be raised by the empire. Some mutilated themselves to become barren. To the Mongols, these were not tragedies. They were inefficiencies. To correct them, the empire invented methods that merged cruelty with order. Women who refused to eat were force-fed through reed tubes, their mouths pried open by iron spoons. Those who destroyed their wombs with sharpened bone were shackled and left under constant watch. If they miscarried, they were examined by the physicians who once studied horses, their failures recorded in ledgers. It was punishment disguised as medicine. Mothers who smothered their infants were not executed in secret. Their deaths were made into spectacles. The Mongols understood that fear was most effective when it was ritualized. Public execution became theatre, a warning, and a sermon. One Persian witness described a scene near the Sirdarya plain. They built a stage of wood and set upon it 3 women accused of killing their babes. They were bound in bronze chains. Before the gathered captives, the executioner broke their ribs one by one with an iron rod, while a herald recited their crimes. When they cried out, he lifted their faces to the sky, so the gods could see what defiance looked like. The crowd was made to watch in silence. No one wept aloud. The Mongols called this ceremony teaching through iron. Each act of brutality was cloaked in justification. It was never rage, it was order. The Khan's law, they said, is the will of heaven. This is how patriarchies sustain themselves, not only through violence, but through the illusion of sanctity. The Mongols, like the Romans before them, and the empires that followed, draped domination in the language of righteousness. The Yasa decreed that the Khan's word was divine command. In breaking women, they claimed to be protecting them from chaos, from hunger, from themselves. Their cruelty was framed as mercy. The empire did not kill without reason. It killed to instruct. Every public punishment carried a lesson. Obedience is peace. Resistance is pain. Inside the camps, ritualized terror became part of daily life. Each dawn began with roll call. The guards would pass among the women, striking the ground with whips. Silence meant compliance. Sound meant guilt. The punishments were swift lashes, branding removal to the black tents from which few returned. The black tents stood apart from the main encampments, their hides coated with soot and grease to absorb sunlight. They were where corrections were carried out. Few saw what happened inside. Survivors spoke of boiling water poured over feet nails pulled with horse tongs, the sound of chains dragged against stone. The Mongols' understanding of terror was almost scientific. They learnt that random cruelty bred despair, but organised cruelty bred obedience. And so they made pain predictable. There were protocols for punishment, who administered it, how long it lasted, when it was to be witnessed. The effect was devastating. Within months, rebellion among the caravans fell to almost nothing. The women no longer screamed during the night. They whispered instead. They learned to make their faces blank. But silence was not surrender, it was camouflage. Beneath the surface, defiance still breathed. The women learned to communicate through gestures, the angle of a braid, the arrangement of stones near the campfire, the way a song paused on a single note. Each was a fragment of rebellion hidden inside routine. Yet the empire's logic remained unshakable. It believed itself just. The officers who carried out torture did not see themselves as monsters, but as functionaries of divine order. They quoted the Yasa before breaking bones. They invoked heaven before spilling blood. Every patriarchal empire writes its violence into law so that it can claim innocence. The Mongols were no different. To them, the hierarchy between conqueror and captive was not moral, it was natural. They spoke of balance the way others speak of grace, men as sky, women as earth. One commands, one yields. But when power sanctifies itself, mercy becomes heresy. Even the Mongol physicians whose hands had once healed horses and herds became complicit. They experimented with mixtures of herbs and metals, led mercury blood ash to strengthen the disobedient. Some were branded on the abdomen with the mark of fertility, others given tonics that induced uncontrollable sleep. The body became laboratory law and punishment at once. In one record found centuries later in a Persian commentary, an anonymous scribe wrote a single line beneath a list of executed women. They were strong as iron and burned like ash. The phrase spread through the camps, women of ash and iron. It became both insult and secret anthem. Guards used it to mock the stubborn. Captives used it to remember the brave. It meant those who endured pain and kept their humanity intact, those who, though broken, refused to disappear. Empires measure themselves by monuments, but every system of domination leaves behind a different monument's silence. The women of ash and iron were the foundation stones of this silence. Their suffering became the unseen architecture of the Mongol peace. And still even silence leaves echoes. The Mongols' laws of control would echo centuries later in other empires, the branding of slaves in Rome, the civilizing edicts of colonial regimes, the sterilization campaigns of modern states. The forms change, the logic endures. When power calls its violence law, it no longer needs cruelty to rule. The threat itself becomes enough. In the wind that swept across the steppe, the women's ashes mingled with dust, their chains rusted into the soil. But the iron of their endurance remained. They were the ones who proved that even when law is written in pain, humanity still resists beneath it. Not every rebellion carries a sword. Some are born in whispers. As the caravans rolled westward, carrying tens of thousands of women in silence, the empire believed its control was complete. Every movement was counted, every voice subdued. But beneath the machinery of conquest, a quieter, older power began to stir the power of memory. It began with gestures, a braid tied on the left instead of the right, a ribbon of red wool hidden beneath the collar of a tunic, the placement of a small stone at the edge of a cooking fire. To the guards, these were nothing. To the women, they were sentences in a secret language. In captivity, where speech could mean death, they built communication out of pattern and rhythm. 3 steps forward before turning one's head meant danger. 2 coughs at dawn meant a death in the night. A child's lullaby repeated with a slight change in melody carried a warning. Do not eat the bread, they have mixed it. It was a language not of words but of survival. Anthropologists who later studied oral traditions among the nomads of Central Asia found echoes of these codes centuries later. Songs that seemed to be about the moon or the wind carried hidden refrains, instructions for escape, recipes for poisons, the names of villages erased from maps. The women of the Mongol caravans had turned their suffering into an archive of sound. When they sang softly, never loud enough for the guards to hear, only for the children pressed against them. The melodies were circular, without beginning or end, as if to mimic the endless journey. Some scholars believe that fragments of these songs survived into later folk lullabies, travelling invisibly through generations. One such fragment, recorded in a 14th century Persian travelogue, translates roughly as, "The road forgets, but the body remembers. The fire sleeps, but the ashes speak. The ashes speak," those 3 words carried through centuries of oral tradition, a testament that even in a world designed to erase the memory found a voice. Some women carved marks into their skin, thin and deliberate, small cuts on the forearm shaped like the Mebth symbols of their lost clans. Others tattooed dots along their ribs in patterns only they could read. The pain was ritual, a way to claim what could not be taken, a moving history etched into flesh. When one woman died, her companions would trace her scars with ash and recite her clan's name 3 times, believing that memory kept the soul tethered to truth. It was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let the empire write their story for them. Children born in the caravans were taught this hidden lexicon before they learned to speak. A hum meant hunger. A touch on the shoulder meant silence. A strand of grass woven into hair meant I am still yours. In this way, memory became rebellion. What the Mongols could count, they could control, but what they could not count, the invisible network of shared memory, they could never destroy. There is a term in anthropology, cultural micro-resistance, the small persistent acts through which oppressed communities maintain identity under domination. The women of the caravans embodied it centuries before the term existed. Their tools were not weapons, but repetition, rhythm and care. Every pot of milk boiled, every child's name whispered at night, every prayer murmured into the earth was an act of reclamation. To nurture life under tyranny was to defy it. Even in the darkest camps, a form of beauty survived. Some women began shaping bits of clay or animal bone into charms, tiny figures of birds, fish, moons. They hid them in the ground, whether they slept as offerings to ancestors, tokens of continuity. In time, these trinkets would be found by archaeologists mislabeled as primitive art. Few realized they were acts of resistance, artifacts of defiance crafted in secret. The Mongols' bureaucracy could destroy villages, but not the small rituals that stitched humanity together. The women's songs, their coded gestures, their markings of skin and soil, all were threads in a vast invisible web that stretched across the empire. When one woman died, her memory did not die with her. It travelled on in those who had memorized her name, her tune, her story. Oral tradition became immortality. In later generations, long after the empire had fractured, these hidden legacies resurfaced as folk tales, stories of women who turned into birds to escape captivity, or who carried their dead children in the folds of the moon. To scholars they are myths, to those who remember they are history disguised as prayer. Within the Mongol system, everything was measured, numbered and classified. But within the songs, nothing was. In that uncounted space lived freedom. The women's resistance did not overthrow empires. It did something rarer, it preserved humanity inside them. Every empire believes it can silence what it conquers, but the voice of memory needs no parchment. It travels through breath, through blood, through the hum of a lullaby at night. And so while the men of conquest wrote laws and ledgers, the women of captivity wrote something else, unseen, unsanctioned, unending. Their record was not ink, it was heartbeat. By 1219 the system was no longer evolving, it was complete. What had begun as improvisation in the Tangut lands and matured amid the ruins of the Jin had now hardened into policy. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, stretching from the Caspian to the Oxus River, was not only one of the largest military campaigns in history, it was the full flowering of Genghis Khan's design, a machinery of conquest so organised, so calculating that it resembled not an army but a government in motion. Khwarezm was rich, complex and proud, a Muslim empire of scholars, merchants and cities whose names glowed with centuries of learning: Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. Each was a jewel in the Silk Road, each ringed with walls and minarets, libraries and gardens. But to Genghis Khan those cities were not jewels, they were data. The Mongols' first strike was not by sword but by map. Spies, traders, monks, prisoners had already charted the empire for years. They documented not just roads and rivers, but people, ethnic groups, languages, family structures, fertility rates. Their intelligence reports read less like war manuals and more like demographics studies. Every target was evaluated not merely for strategic value, but for its reproductive potential. Nomadic tribes were noted for endurance, urban populations for literacy and craft. When Genghis sent his generals west, he gave them not only military orders, but instructions on classification. Take the scholars and scribes for counting, the artisans for labour, the mothers for continuity. It was an empire run like a census. When the Khwarezmian Shah betrayed his envoys, executing one, humiliating the rest, the reprisal was inevitable. But it was not blind vengeance. It was calibrated extermination. The Mongols did not rush. They advanced like a glacier, slow and unstoppable, devouring each province with identical precision. Every conquest followed the same sequence. First came the scouts, then the soldiers, then the scribes. The scouts noted population clusters, measured distances, recorded weather. The soldiers executed resistance. The scribes followed with ink and knife. Each city became a case study in control. After Otrar fell, the entire population was sorted by trade and sex. Men who could bear arms were executed. Artisans were tagged for deportation. Women were branded on the wrist and added to the caravans. Infants were examined and separated, those deemed strong sent east to be raised as servants of the empire, the weak abandoned. In Bukhara, where mosques once echoed with Quranic verse, Mongol officers turned sanctuaries into sorting stations. A chronicler recorded the scene with horror. In the house of prayer, they placed the tables of record. Where men once recited God's name, now women were measured and weighed. It was not chaos, it was administration. What made the Mongol conquest of Khwarezm so terrifying was not its scale of violence, but its consistency. The same procedures appeared in city after city, thousands of miles apart, executed with a bureaucratic precision. The Mongols had created an empire of templates. Their intelligence networks rivaled anything the ancient world had known. Couriers rode along pre-established routes, the Yam, delivering reports to the central camp. These reports listed not only military outcomes, but the number of captives in each category, warriors, killed craftsmen, reassigned women of fertile age, secured. Each general was judged not only by victories, but by ratios. Efficiency was measured in human yield. And with the Khwarezmian campaign, the Mongols refined a new element of control redistribution. Populations were uprooted and transplanted thousands of miles away. Entire villages disappeared from one province and reappeared in another, absorbed into the infrastructure of conquest. This practice would echo centuries later from the Ottoman devshirme to the Atlantic slave trade, from colonial indenture ships to the Gulag deportations. The Mongols did not invent mass relocation. They demonstrated how it could serve not only punishment but policy. In the Khwarezm heartland, caravans now moved in both directions. some east, some west, like veins feeding a single imperial heart. Each caravan was a chain of purpose, smiths to rebuild weapons, scribes to maintain records, women to bear the next generation of obedient subjects. Their movement was timed to seasons, coordinated by signal fires, protected by detachments of mounted guards. Even the logistics were extraordinary. Supply posts were established every 30 miles with reserves of grain, water and horses. It was said that a letter could travel from Samarkand to Karakoram 3,000 miles in less than 2 weeks. Along those same routes, captives travelled too, their steps synchronized with the empire's pulse. To modern historians, the Mongols' efficiency evokes admiration and revulsion in equal measure. They embodied a principle that would haunt the centuries that evil need not be chaotic to be immense. The Khwarezmian campaign proved the Mongols' transformation from raiders into administrators of life and death. For every atrocity there was an accountant, for every fire a record, for every body a number. Theirs was no longer a war of men against men, it was a war of systems against souls. A Persian historian, Juvayni, described entering Bukhara after its fall. The city was silent save for the scratching of pens. The scribes wrote without rest, as if they feared the world would end before they finished. He meant it metaphorically, but he was right. By the time the campaign ended, the Mongols had depopulated vast stretches of Central Asia. But they had also created the foundations of a new world order, a transcontinental organism powered by data discipline and breeding. The caravans that once trailed behind as shadows were now institutions. They had command hierarchies, quotas, even replacement protocols. Each pregnancy, each birth, each death fed back into the empire's administrative bloodstream. The steppe had become a living laboratory, and Genghis Khan, far from the front lines, read the reports with calm satisfaction. The system was self-sustaining. It no longer needed his presence, only his principles. In the endless plains where his armies camped, banners snapped in the wind, a symphony of order born from ruin. In the ashes of Khwarezm, the machine had perfected itself, and in that perfection, it revealed something timeless, that the most terrifying empires are not those that destroy recklessly, but those that destroy with reason. Not all captives were treated equally. In the hierarchy of empire, even subjugation had its ranks. As the Mongol conquests expanded west and south, the women of nobility princesses, wives of governors, daughters of scholars were set apart. Their fate differed not because of mercy, but because of calculation. To Genghis Khan and his administrators, noble women were not simply spoils. They were assets, living vessels of political legitimacy and genetic refinement, where the ordinary caravans processed the masses into labour and reproduction. The noble captives were reserved for a more deliberate purpose, selective breeding. In the Mongol mind, lineage was both symbol and science. They believed that courage, beauty and intelligence passed through blood like inherited pasture rights. To dilute such qualities was to waste divine favour. To absorb them was to strengthen the lineage of the Khan. This belief was not unique to the steppe. Across the ancient world, empires had long fused power and procreation. The Assyrians intermarried with royal captives to legitimize conquered thrones. The Persians took noble brides from subjugated realms as proof of divinely sanctioned victory. The Romans bred their patricians like prize horses, tracing features and temperaments down generations. The Mongols took these precedents and made them policy. In the Khwarezmian cities, officers and scribes identified noble women by family features and education. They were separated from the common captives, transported in guarded wagons and placed in compounds near the main encampments. There, under constant supervision, they were fed, well clothed in silk and treated with what appeared to be dignity. But it was not kindness, it was cultivation. They were the empire's genetic treasury. Among the Mongol elite, marriage alliances were not private unions but public statements of dominion. Genghis himself had taken wives from conquered dynasties Tangut-Jin Khitan and later Persian. His generals followed suit. Each royal woman represented an absorbed bloodline, a conquered claim to sovereignty. Through them, the Mongols inherited not just territory but legitimacy itself. Within this logic lay the roots of something darker, a nascent form of eugenics centuries before the term existed. The empire's chroniclers recorded births among noble captives with near religious attention. Children born of high-born mothers were labelled sul-pure spirits. They were given better tutors, higher rations and positions within the administrative or military hierarchy. Those of peasant or mixed lineage were marked Haran of dust and relegated to labour or servitude. It was biology as destiny written in empire's script. Physiognomy fascinated the Mongols. They believed a man's virtues could be read in his bones and a woman's in her face. Wide-set eyes indicated endurance, full lips fertility, a high-brow intellect. Officers and physicians were trained to assess such traits in captives, blending superstition and anthropology into policy. One surviving fragment of a Persian medical text, likely translated from Mongol sources, lists the favourable signs of breeding women: clear eyes, low voice, firm gait, hips broad but not heavy temper, calm. Avoid the narrow-boned, the loud, and the weeping kind. Such lists transformed living women into breeding stock described with the same precision as horses or camels, and yet for all their brutality, the Mongols cloaked this system in sacred language. They claimed divine mandate that the eternal blue heaven had chosen them to purify the world's bloodlines. To them, selective breeding was not sin but service. By blending the noblest families of the conquered into their own, they believed they were fulfilling heaven's design: one race, one empire, one whole line of descent reaching back to the sky. This ideology echoed far beyond the steppe. Later dynasties, Timurid, Mughal, even Qing, would inherit the same obsession with blood purity and aesthetic perfection. European courts centuries later would do likewise under different names. Renaissance treatises on noble breeding, Habsburg marriage charts, colonial racial hygiene programs all repeated the same illusion, first codified in the tents of the Mongol plain that virtue, power, and intelligence could be measured in flesh. The Mongols' interest in noble bloodlines was not only political, it was metaphysical. Their shamans taught that a conqueror's essence could reincarnate through his descendants. To mix with common blood was to weaken the soul's future vessel. Thus, even in their afterlife, mythology control over women's bodies became control over eternity itself. For noble women captured from Persia or China, this meant a life of ritualized confinement. They were dressed in fine garments, but never allowed to travel freely. They dined with silver bowls, yet lived surrounded by guards. They were encouraged to bear children for the Khan's lineage, their every pregnancy treated as state matter. One Chinese chronicler described the contradiction. The ladies of rank are kept as queens but live as prisoners. Their sons are called princes, yet they are strangers to their mothers' tongues. It was assimilation disguised as honour, a quiet annihilation that used silk instead of chains. Meanwhile, peasant women remained the labouring wombs of empire. They carried the next generation of soldiers, workers, and concubines, the nameless masses that filled the empire's veins. The system needed both the noble to ennoble the common to multiply. Together they formed the two halves of the imperial body. But this hierarchy carried an irony. As generations passed, the bloodlines blurred. The descendants of noble captives intermarried with Mongol generals, their features mingled, their languages mixed. The very empire that preached purity was creating hybridity on a continental scale. By the time Genghis Khan's grandsons ruled, his pure line stretched across Asia like a web of contradictions, part Mongol, part Persian, part Chinese, part Turkic. The experiment in control had produced not order, but diversity. The empire could command births, but not identity. Still for a moment in the early 13th century, the illusion held. In their tents of felt and silk, the conquerors believed they had tamed humanity's chaos, not through fear but through flesh. They saw the world as herd and bloodline and themselves as its breeders. It was power distilled to its most intimate form. And behind the curtain of ritual and law, thousands of noble women lived the same paradox, honoured yet erased, elevated yet enslaved their beauty, recorded their freedom, forgotten. History remembers their names only through the sons they bore. The empire remembered them through the faces of those sons, faces that looked in part like their conquerors. Genghis Khan's empire would one day crumble, the borders shift, the cities fall, the languages fade. But what he built did not die with the maps. It lived on in the flesh of those who survived him. The true genius and the deepest horror of his design was that he had discovered something no ruler before him had understood so completely: territory can be lost, monuments can be burned, but blood endures. By the final years of his life, this belief had hardened into doctrine. His generals spoke of bloodlines the way priests spoke of souls. The empire's ledgers had become genealogies. The census was not only of land or livestock, but of lineage, an accounting of humanity's rearrangement under Mongol rule. When Genghis looked upon the steppe, he no longer saw tribes or nations. He saw networks of kinship stretching outward like veins. Where others saw empire, he saw inheritance. It was a biological vision of dominion. He had witnessed firsthand how conquest through fear was temporary, how defeated cities could rise again, how rebellions could ignite from memory. But conquest through birth was permanent. Once the conqueror's seed had taken root, even rebellion carried his blood. In one account preserved by a Persian chronicler, Genghis is said to have told his sons, "A land may forget your banners, but it cannot forget your children." Whether those words were truly his or invented by later historians, the idea was prophetic. Centuries later, in the laboratories of modern science, his strategy would reveal itself in numbers. Geneticists studying Y chromosome inheritance, a marker passed from father to son, found something extraordinary. Across the vast expanse once ruled by the Mongols, from the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Uzbekistan and the mountains of Afghanistan, millions of men share nearly identical genetic signatures. The pattern is unmistakable. 1 in every 200 men on Earth descends directly from Genghis Khan or his immediate male relatives. 16 million lives carrying a fragment of one man's body. The discovery stunned the world, yet it only confirmed what the Mongols themselves had believed in mythic terms, that lineage is the truest empire, invisible and immortal. To the Mongols, ancestry was divine architecture. They called themselves the people of the eternal sky, believing that the soul's essence moved through generations like the wind over the plains seen only in motion. Genghis had transformed that myth into policy. Every conquered people became part of his cosmology. He did not just unite lands, he rewrote human geography. But the legacy he left was twofold: pride and trauma victory, and violation bound together in blood. For many in Central Asia, descent from the Great Khan became a badge of nobility. Centuries after his death, princes and khans still trace their legitimacy to his line. Even in modern Mongolia, families keep oral genealogies stretching back to him, some myth, some memory. The name carries weight, a whisper of divine favour. And yet the same blood that grants pride carries grief. For millions, those genes are the inheritance of violence, the echo of a body taken, a village erased, a life reclassified into empire. In their DNA lives both the conqueror and the conquered. What then does it mean to carry his mark? Science can identify the sequence but not the story. The Y chromosome reveals the presence of a man but not the silence that followed him. Behind each genetic lineage is a woman who did not choose a child, who never knew the name of the father he resembled. The biological empire endures, but it is an empire of ghosts. Every drop of blood that bears the Mongol signature carries contradiction. Pride in ancestry, shame in origin. Heritage intertwined with harm. Modern genealogists marvel at the scale, how one man's reproductive success reshaped the human map. But in that success lies the most haunting truth of all, that history's greatest empire was not built of stone or law, but of cells dividing endlessly, silently across centuries. For Genghis, this was victory beyond death. His dynasty could fracture, his capital crumble, but the world itself would carry his memory beneath its skin. His genes became the new banners, fluttering unseen in the marrow of strangers. When he died in 1227, the Great Khan was buried in secrecy. His tomb was hidden, his location erased, his servants executed to preserve the silence. Yet his true monument required no stone. It walked the earth in human form. Every living descendant, known or unknown, is a continuation of that experiment begun on the steppe. They are living documents of both domination and endurance. And perhaps that is the final paradox of Genghis Khan's vision. He conquered humanity not by erasing it, but by embedding himself within it. The empire dissolved, but the empire of blood remained. And in that inheritance lies a question that outlives history itself. When power leaves its mark upon the body, can the body ever truly forget? When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the earth swallowed his body in silence, but not his system. His empire did not mourn, it reorganized. For the Mongols, death was never an end, but a transfer of duty. The machinery he built had already learned to run without him. The sons and grandsons who followed were not visionaries in his mould. They were engineers maintaining a vast living mechanism. What Genghis had conceived as biological conquest, his heirs refined into dynastic policy, spreading his template of control across 3 continents and adapting it to every culture they absorbed. They called it Ulig, the inheritance. The world called it the Mongol peace. Ugadi, Khan Genghis's chosen successor, ruled from the newly built capital of Karakoram, a city that pulsed like a heart at the centre of the empire. From there he dispatched armies in every direction to the forests of Russia, the plains of Hungary, the deserts of Persia. But Ugadi did not simply send soldiers. He sent administrators, census officers and marriage brokers. In Europe, his generals discovered a new kind of wealth, the daughters of minor kings and noble houses taken as hostages, then as wives. Each alliance was a seed. Local chronicles in Hungary record the arrival of Mongol envoys demanding tribute not only in gold or livestock, but in brides of healthy womb and strong stock. The old steppe logic of selective breeding had crossed into Christendom, but the Mongols were pragmatic conquerors. They learned to wear local customs like armour. In Eastern Europe, Ojibwa's officials adopted the trappings of Christian ceremony to legitimize the unions. A priest would bless the marriage in Latin, while Mongol interpreters translated the vows into Turkic. The result was neither Christian nor pagan, a hybrid ritual as functional as the empire itself. From these unions came the white children, half European, half Mongol, raised in the mixed camps that trailed the Western armies. They learned to ride and pray in two languages, symbols of empire's adaptability. For the Mongols, these children were more than offspring. They were bridges, proof that conquest could reshape humanity's map one generation at a time. Further south, Genghis Khan, grandson of Genghis, extended the system into the Islamic world. His campaigns against the Abbasid Caliphate and the Persian states produced a flood of captive scholars and artisans. But where Genghis had relied on raw coercion, Mongol fused brutality with cultural intelligence. He recognized the power of legitimacy in the Muslim world, where descent from noble or prophetic lineages commanded awe. So the Mongols adopted the language of genealogy itself. Captive women of Quraysh or Sayyid descent. Those claiming kinship with the Prophet were treated with ceremonial respect. They were placed in guarded households compelled to bear sons for Mongol princes, who then claimed partial descent from the Prophet's line. It was appropriation elevated to theology. Persian chroniclers, horrified, recorded it plainly. They mingle the blood of kings with the blood of heaven and call it blessing. Mongol's administrators codified these practices into law. Birth registries listed both maternal and paternal lineage, assigning rank accordingly. The highest value was given to children born of noble or religious mothers, a policy that echoed later in Ottoman and Mughal courts. The Mongols' genius lay in this flexibility. Wherever they went, they learned the local logic of legitimacy and turned it to their advantage. In the East, Kublai Khan, the empire's philosopher king, applied the same biological pragmatism in China but wrapped it in Confucian silk. He knew that the Chinese revered ancestry as sacred, so he reversed the formula. Instead of erasing lineage, he absorbed it. He married women from the defeated Song imperial family, transforming bloodlines of resistance into symbols of unity. His court scholars proclaimed a new doctrine that heaven had joined the steppe and the Middle Kingdom through these unions. The bureaucratic obsession with recording blood reached unprecedented heights under Kublai. Midwives, physicians, and census clerks worked side by side, filling scrolls with information about births across the Yuan dynasty. Some of these records still survive astonishingly detailed lists of infants categorized by region, ethnicity, and type. Chinese physicians introduced new methods of fertility assessment, pulse reading, facial diagnosis, herbal regulation, which the Mongols eagerly adopted. Imperial medical texts from the 1260s described tonics designed to ensure the birth of male heirs and prevent miscarriage among high-ranking wives. In the vast harem complexes of Beijing Mongol and Chinese customs merged ritual fasting before conception, prayers to both heaven and the eternal blue sky, and offerings of incense to ancestral spirits. It was the fusion of two civilizations in the most intimate domain, the body itself. Everywhere the Mongols went, they adapted, absorbing the customs of the conquered and bending them to their own end replication. In Europe, they used Christian marriage. In Persia, noble blood. In China, ancestral reverence. Each culture offered its own doorway into permanence. The empire became a mirror reflecting the traditions it conquered back upon themselves, and behind the adaptation lay a chilling consistency: all reproduction served the state. Whether sanctified by priests, justified by prophets, or blessed by heaven, the purpose was the same: to multiply Mongol lineage until it filled the world. The Mongols called their rulers sons of heaven, but by the 13th century the phrase had acquired literal meaning. Their sons born of every continent, speaking a dozen tongues, were the empire's true expansion. From Hungary to Korea, the children of Mongol princes carried the same blood but wore different faces. Some became Buddhist monks, others Muslim emirs, others Christian knights. The empire had dissolved into humanity itself. Historians often call this era Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, but that peace was the stillness of absorption, not harmony. It was the calm of a system that no longer needed conquest because it had conquered the future. By the time Kublai ruled in China, the Mongol state no longer required constant war. Its reproduction, biological, political, and cultural, had achieved momentum of its own. The dynasty of replication was complete. Across Eurasia, temples, mosques, and cathedrals alike housed descendants of the Khan. Their names changed, their features softened, but their blood unchanged. The empire that began with a single tribe of horsemen had multiplied itself into the human genome, and thus even as the Mongols began to fade from maps, they remained in the world's arteries, riding unseen in blood, memory, and myth. The year was 1227. On a wind-scoured plain, somewhere between the Onon and the Kurlan rivers, the man who had once called himself the ruler of all beneath the sky lay dying. His tent was sealed against the dust and the sound of the steppe. The constant low hum of wind and grass was drowned by the murmuring of shamans outside, their chants rising and falling like the breath of the land itself. No chronicler witnessed his final moment. No priest recorded his last words. But the Mongols who guarded the camp remembered the silence that followed. A stillness so complete that even the horses seemed to stop breathing. When the great Khan died, the sky did not thunder. It simply darkened. That night, a thin moon hung above the plains, silver and cold. A procession formed around the tent, his general's sons and chosen slaves, faces pale in the ghostly light. They carried him not as a corpse, but as a secret. By decree, no one was to know where he would rest. The steppe would keep him not a tomb. The funeral caravan moved through the darkness, an army of shadows. The drums beat once, twice, and then fell silent. Horses, oxen, and men marched side by side, leaving no trail. The earth swallowed their prints almost as soon as they formed. At every river crossing, the soldiers killed those who had seen them pass. Peasants, travellers, shepherdess, any witness to the procession's route was cut down. The path to the tomb was to vanish with the witnesses. Death itself became classified. The Mongols called it Kori, the sealing, an ancient ritual of erasure reserved for great leaders. They buried him somewhere under a hill, it is said, or perhaps in a forest beneath the roots of trees, whose shadows never touched the same place twice. His horse was slain beside him, and his weapons laid in the earth. Around the grave they built no monument, raised no cairn, only silence. Then came the slaughter. 40 virgins chosen from the empire's captives were brought to his bier. They were strangled, their bodies laid in a ring around his tomb as offerings to accompany him into the afterlife. When the grave was sealed, hundreds of slaves who had built it were killed in turn, their blood mixed with the soil to conceal its location. Finally, the soldiers who guarded the secret were themselves executed, leaving no living memory of the path. When the last drumbeat faded, the moon rose higher, pale as bone. And there on the endless plain, an empire paused to breathe. It was said that the Khan's spirit ascended as a hawk into the dark sky, circling once before vanishing into the stars. But what truly rose that night was not his soul, it was his system. The body beneath the earth was mortal. The order he had created was not. In the months after his death, the empire did not falter. Caravans still rolled, scribes still recorded, soldiers still marched. The machine had learned to move without its architect. In that sense, the funeral was not an ending, but a replication. The same cold efficiency that had defined his life, defined his death secrecy, control ritual, precision. The burial itself was an extension of the empire's logic knowledge. Restricted witnesses eliminated the event rendered invisible yet absolute. The steppe absorbed him, as it had absorbed countless others, but unlike them he did not disappear. His absence became omnipresence. In the decades that followed, the legend of his resting place grew. Some said a river was diverted to flow over his grave so that no man might walk upon it. Others claimed his tomb was guarded by eternal soldiers who rose from the earth on moonless nights. To his descendants, the mystery itself was sacred, a metaphor for his system. Unseen, but everywhere. Even in death he ruled through invisibility. The silence that followed the drums was the silence of something completed. An empire that had conquered the body now existed without one. Centuries later, explorers would scour the Mongolian highlands searching for the lost tomb. They would find bones, burial mounds, and whispers, but never certainty. It was as if the land itself refused to betray him, as if his order still compelled obedience from the earth. And perhaps that is fitting. For Genghis Khan's true grave was not in a single hill or valley. It was spread across the continents he had reshaped, buried in the bones of millions, encoded in the blood of their descendants. The wind that night carried more than mourning. It carried continuation. As the procession disappeared into the steppe, the stars shone coldly above their light reflected in the iron of Mongol helmets. The empire did not end, it simply changed form. The man who had commanded bodies now commanded time. His heart had stopped, but the system beat on. In the hush after the final drum, the steps seemed to whisper what no historian could ever write. Death cannot contain a design that has already entered the living. Centuries later, the silence broke. Near Bukhara, under the indifferent sun of modern Uzbekistan, a team of archaeologists digging at the edge of an ancient caravan route uncovered what at first seemed like a collapsed storeroom. The soil was dense grey, heavy with the bad smell of salt and age. But when the first spade struck bone and then another, the pattern became unmistakable. It was not a building. It was a grave, a long trench carefully shaped large enough to hold hundreds. The skeletons were mostly female, young, compact frames, some no older than 14. Their bones told the story that no chronicle had dared to preserve. They showed signs of malnutrition, porous skulls, thin ribs, stress, fractures in the arms from labour. Some had marks on the wrists and ankles, calluses, where ropes had bitten the skin. Others bore healed fractures as if they had been struck and left to mend without aid. Several still had jewellery, small copper earrings, fragments of bone beads, proof that even stripped of freedom they had clung to some trace of identity. The soil was rich with carbonised ash remnants of burned fabric and wood. The excavation reports noted a consistent layering ashbone and sand. Ashbone and sand. It was the same rhythm as the empire that had buried the order in atrocity. At the nearby site of Vabkent, another mass grave was found, this one containing both women and children. The small skeletons lay curled against larger ones, mothers and infants buried together. Archaeologists stopped counting after 200. One of the researchers, a young Uzbek woman named Layla, wrote in her field journal, "They died holding each other." That too is data. To science, these were specimens. To history, they were confirmation. But to the earth, they were memory. In the laboratory, the analysis began. Samples of bone powder were taken, sealed in sterile containers, and sent for isotopic testing. Under the fluorescent lights of a European research institute, the past came back to life in molecular form. Strontium isotope ratios revealed that many of the women were not native to the region. Some came from as far east as northern China, others from the Caucasus, still others from the steppe itself. They had been moved, transported hundreds, even thousands of miles. Stable nitrogen levels indicated periods of starvation punctuated by brief nutrition spikes, suggesting that food had been rationed selectively, just enough to sustain, never enough to strengthen. DNA analysis confirmed mixed ancestry among the remains, Central Asian, East Asian, Persian and Turkic lineages, woven together in patterns impossible to explain by trade alone. The scientists had no doubt. These were not random burials from war. They were structured, systematic, a population processed, relocated and erased. Forensic archaeologists mapped the bones, digitally reconstructing postures and placement. The data revealed organization even in death rows, a line north to south spacing consistent hands positioned across the chest or over the abdomen. A mass grave, yes, but with administrative precision. Every pattern whispered the same truth: this was not chaos, it was management. Carbon dating placed the site between 1219 and 1223, the years of the Khwarezmian campaign. The empire had passed here, leaving behind no monuments, no inscriptions, only bones. To modern scientists, these discoveries were historic. To the quiet of the soil, they were confession. Imagine for a moment if the ground could speak. It would remember the vibration of hooves overhead, the weight of wagons, the muffled weeping of those led to the pits. It would remember how the air changed after how the heat of summer pressed down on the freshly turned earth, how the first rain carried the smell of iron and smoke. The soil, if it had a voice, would not speak of battles or kings. It would recite names, forgotten syllables buried with the bones. It would tell us that some of the women were mothers, some were children, some still clutching the remnants of home. It would tell us that before the bones dried, they were warm with life. When the archaeologists brushed away the final layer of dust, they found small traces of human tenderness. A hand clasping another, a necklace buried between ribs, a child's teeth marks on the bone of a mother's arm. These fragments transformed statistics into stories, and yet in scientific language they became sterile again. The reports read subject 47 female 20 to 25 years healed radial fracture dental enamel hypoplasia. The living made tidy what history had left unbearable. Still the bones refused to stay silent. Through the microscope's lens in the twist of DNA strands, their legacy spoke a truth larger than any single empire that control over life always writes its final record in death. The graves near Bukhara, the scattered pits of Samarkand, the burial trenches in northern Iran, they form a network of memory invisible on maps, but connected in the same pattern as Genghis Khan's empire once was. Where his roads once carried soldiers, his legacy now carries silence. Archaeologists in their way are the empire's last accountants tallying what was once lost. But unlike the Mongol scribes, they count with reverence. Every bone they lift from the soil is a ledger of endurance, a refusal to vanish entirely. When the field lights dim at night, the excavation site falls quiet again. The wind crosses the steppe just as it did 800 years ago. If you listen closely, it almost sounds like breathing. Perhaps it is. Perhaps the soil still exhales the memory of those it swallowed. The soft murmur of countless women who once sang in captivity, whose ashes mingled with dust, whose stories found new life in the language of science. The empire may have ruled for a century, but the graves still speak, and in their unending silence they remind us that history does not disappear. It waits patient beneath our feet until we are ready to hear it. Under the microscope, history has no borders. In laboratories from Cambridge to Seoul, technicians place vials of powdered bone and saliva into centrifuges, spin them until time itself separates. What emerges is not legend or language, but code, the double helix that outlasted empires. When geneticists first began mapping Y chromosomes across Eurasia in the early 2000s, they noticed something strange. A vast cluster of nearly identical markers stretching from the Yellow River to the Volga, from the Himalayas to the Caspian Sea. At first, it seemed like an anomaly, too consistent, too concentrated. Then the pattern resolved. It was a single family, one lineage, one man, Genghis Khan. 16 million men alive today share his Y chromosome signature, 1 in every 200. In Mongolia itself, nearly 1 in 12. The map glows like a constellation of kinship, a quiet empire spread not across territory, but through the bloodstream. What the Mongols called heaven's favour, modern science calls genetic proliferation. The result is the same dominance inscribed in biology. The numbers alone defy imagination. 16 million lives each, carrying a fragment of his genome builders and bankers, farmers and monks' children, who will never know the name they bear in silence. In their veins flows the proof that conquest does not always end with death. Sometimes it keeps reproducing quietly and visibly generation after generation. But what does it mean to inherit a legacy that was never chosen? The story of human genetics is not only a story of survival, it is a record of violation. Each mutation, each inherited strand tells both creation and destruction. The same code that connects descendants to the conqueror connects them too to the women whose bodies were conscripted into empire. Genetic success, if success it can be called, is immoral. The DNA does not care how it's spread. It does not distinguish between love and violence, between consent and command. It only replicates. And that is the paradox. The most biologically successful man in history achieved his immortality through one of humanity's greatest moral catastrophes. This is the question modern science cannot answer. The data proves descent, but not destiny. It can trace the lineage, but not the meaning. It can say who we came from, but not what we owe them. In genetic charts, Genghis Khan's descendants are dots connected by thin lines. But in the real world, they are infinite variations of face and skin, voice and language. You could meet one anywhere, a shopkeeper in Istanbul, a herdsman in Inner Mongolia, a banker in London, a schoolteacher in Lima. None of them feel the weight of his name, yet all carry some echo of his body. A century ago, to bear royal blood was a matter of pride. Today it is an accident of chromosomes. Identity once sacred has become molecular. The empire that was once drawn in ink now exists as probability. And still the moral question remains, if suffering built the inheritance, can the inheritance ever be innocent? Historians measure empires by walls and wars, but biology measures them by replication. The Mongol conquest by that measure never ended. It spread outward like a ripple in a pool carried not by armies, but by families, millions of them unaware. To carry his DNA is neither blessing nor curse, it is reminder. A reminder that the human story is written in mixtures and collisions in both cruelty and resilience. Every genetic map is both evidence of domination and testament to endurance. The empire's banners are gone, its cities long reclaimed by dust. But the genetic map remains a quiet network of inheritance that refuses to fade. When modern scientists published their findings, one of them wrote a line that might have pleased the great Khan himself. His empire has vanished, but his lineage remains the largest the world has ever seen. 8 centuries later, his conquest continues, not through fear or war, but through birth. And yet perhaps the true inheritance is not his DNA, but the question he leaves behind. If our blood remembers everything, what does it forgive? History often remembers killers by the weapons they wielded: swords, guns, bombs. But the deadliest instruments are quieter brushes, quills, and ink. The Mongol Empire was not sustained by brutality alone. Its endurance depended on something colder: its paper trail. Behind every massacre stood an administrator. Behind every caravan a clerk. Their pens moved faster than the horses. In a tent outside Samarkand, under the dim glow of tallow lamps, Mongol scribes sat cross-legged before scrolls of birch bark and silk. They recorded everything: the number of captives, the pregnancies confirmed, the rations consumed, the infants born and judged. Each entry ended not with lament, but with a seal. A red mark meant approval, a black meant elimination. They did not see themselves as executioners, they were accountants. Even the physicians were part of this bureaucracy of control. They examined women not for healing, but for productivity. They prescribed herbs to stimulate fertility, measured wombs for capacity, and kept ledgers noting which regions produced the strongest offspring. A perfect child was considered a successful outcome, a stillbirth an administrative failure. What began as empire building evolved into empire measuring. Humanity became a data set. The Mongols were among the first to standardize the census as an instrument of rule. To count was to own. Entire populations were reduced to columns and figures, families by 10 tribes, by 100 women by womb. It was domination translated into numbers. It is tempting to imagine this as a medieval anomaly, a relic of an unscientific age. But the pattern survives, replicated in every bureaucracy that has confused efficiency with morality. Centuries later, the Nazis would fill Europe with their own clerks and doctors, tallying lives as data points in their pursuit of racial order. In the archives of the SS, researchers found ledgers almost identical in tone to Mongol records: dry procedural detached, transported 2847, processed 2847, no adjectives, no emotion, just math. The same handwriting appears across time in colonial offices of the British Raj, counting productive natives in Belgian Congo reports, measuring amputations as quotas in apartheid, South Africa's racial registries, and the digital forms of the 20th century's eugenic boards. The script changes, the logic does not. Evil rarely announces itself with fury. It prefers order. The Mongols' true innovation was not the sword, it was the system. Their power lay in converting chaos into administration, in replacing the unpredictability of conquest with the predictability of process. In one recovered Mongol document, its authenticity debated, but its tone eerily plausible. A scribe writes, "The Khan does not require cruelty, he requires accuracy." That line could have been written in any century. When power becomes paperwork, morality becomes optional. The clerks of empire do not see corpses, they see compliance. They do not hear screams, they hear results. One might think that modernity, with its laws and oversight, has cured this impulse. But in truth, the bureaucracy of control has only changed medium. Today, the census has become the database, the scribe a server, the seal a biometric scan. Populations are still counted, classified, and optimized, only the ink has turned to code. Every empire, ancient or digital, hides its violence behind administration. Whether it is a Mongol clerk marking the wrist of a captive or a modern algorithm deciding who receives aid and who is denied, the principle remains: to manage is to dominate. Consider this: the same logic that once measured wombs now measures clicks. The same hunger for order that once branded flesh now brands identity. The spreadsheet is simply the parchment reborn. The Mongol record keepers believed that documentation made their world rational. They could not see that it made their cruelty sustainable. Evil multiplied precisely because it was organized. A modern historian once described the Nazi concentration camp system as an empire of files. The Mongol state 8 centuries earlier was the prototype, an empire of scrolls. Their archives, those that survived, are uncanny in tone, dispassionate, bureaucratic, even polite. One document lists non-compliant units eliminated to preserve harmony. Another calculates food supplies based on female throughput efficiency. They read not as accounts of atrocity, but as logistical memos. The true mask of evil is not rage, it is professionalism. When future archaeologists unearthed those scrolls, they found the handwriting neat, deliberate. The letters did not tremble. The ink had faded, but the intent remained to make horror look like governance. The Mongols taught a lesson that the centuries have not unlearned. that when you can reduce life to numbers, you can destroy without conscience. The same ink that once drew borders also erased names. And perhaps that is the most chilling continuity of all that civilization in its quest for order still speaks the language of the scribe. We call it efficiency. The past calls it obedience. The dead might call it something else entirely, silence in handwriting. Long after the banners fell, long after the ink faded from the Mongol ledgers, something quieter endured. Not the records of conquest, but the echoes of those who refused to vanish. The caravans are gone now, the iron carts, the dust, the guards, but their silence has left its own kind of music. It survives in fragments, a child's lullaby in an Uzbek village, a line of melody hummed by shepherd women on the steppe, a story whispered beside a fire when the wind outside sounds like hooves. The empire had catalogued everything it could: births, deaths, bodies, measurements. But it never learned to measure memory. That was the one domain it could not conquer. When archaeologists in the 20th century began collecting folk songs from Mongolia, they found verses whose meanings had long been forgotten. Yet some of the words old Turkic Persian Tangut belonged to languages that should not have been there. In those mismatched syllables lay the ghostly fingerprints of the women carried across continents. One melody recorded in a mountain village north of Kovd repeats only 2 lines. The river carries the mother's name, the wind returns it to the child. No one in the village could explain what the words meant, but perhaps they didn't need to. Some meanings are carried not by definition, but by inheritance. In the camps, women had carved their names into the wooden sides of wagons, into the bones of livestock, into the skin of their own arms. When their words were erased, they turned to gesture. When gestures were forbidden, they turned to sound. A hum could travel where writing could not. Each song was both mourning and rebellion, a heartbeat disguised as melody. Imagine them a night without stars, the air thick with ash, a mother rocking her newborn beneath a wagon canopy. Around her, the other captives sleep or pretend to. She hums a tune she once heard in her mother's kitchen, altering it slightly so that it becomes hers alone. She inserts the child's name between the verses, softly enough that only he can hear. That name is his inheritance. When he grows, when the empire calls him soldier or servant or slave, the tune will return to him in dreams. He will not remember the words, but he will remember the warmth of the sound. And somewhere in that warmth the truth survives that he was loved before he was numbered. This is how memory hides itself into a rhythm in breath in the spaces between language. The Mongol scribes wrote to control, the women sang to continue. Each melody was an act of defiance against oblivion. In later centuries, those songs migrated into folk tales. The mother became a bird that flew across mountains to find her stolen child. The child became a wolf that returned each spring to guard her grave. Listeners called these stories legends, but their structure mirrors the pattern of trauma itself. Loss transformed into ritual pain, reshaped into continuity. Even in silence, the resistance continued. In the graves near Samarkand, archaeologists found small objects buried with the dead carved wooden birds' bone pendants, shards etched with simple lines. Under magnification, those lines revealed patterns, repeated circles, wave-like curves, or rhythmic scratches that matched the cadence of song. It was as if their makers had recorded music in matter, carving memory into time. Every empire creates its monuments in stone. The conquered create theirs in sound. One fades when the quarry empties, the other endures wherever a voice remains. If you travel today across this steppe in spring, you can still hear the long, wavering tones of throat singers drifting across the valleys. To outsiders, it sounds like wind, like distance. To those who listen closely, it sounds like continuity, a vibration passed from breath to breath for 800 years. Perhaps it began as lament. Perhaps it is still one. The Mongol archives are gone, burned, lost, scattered, but the melodies remain reappearing in lullabies, wedding songs, dirges. They carry no dates, no signatures, yet they hold more truth than the empire's chronicles ever did. Because music remembers what bureaucracy forgets, that every statistic was once a heartbeat. And though the empire mastered obedience, it never mastered the human need to be remembered. The songs of the caravan survived not because they were written, but because they were felt passed through generations, like breath through lungs, echoing in places no empire can reach: the body, the voice, the silence after a child falls asleep. What began as survival became tradition. What began as mourning became art. The women who once sang in fear gave the world something that could not be enslaved: rhythm. And rhythm, unlike empire, never ends. It only changes form into language, into cradle song, into the quiet hum that still drifts through Mongolian twilight. If you listen closely enough, you might still hear it. Not the sound of conquest, but the sound that outlived it. A song without author, without beginning, without end. The empire fell, the cities burned, the banners rotted, the horses turned to bone. Yet something of it remains not in ruins or chronicles, but beneath our skin. 8 centuries have passed since the last drum of the Mongol horde echoed across the steppe, yet the rhythm continues steady and unseen. It beats in the quiet of cells dividing in the map of DNA that links strangers across continents in the inherited stories we can no longer trace to their source. Every human life carries a library. Some shelves hold pride, others pain. Some contain the echoes of empire. What Genghis Khan built was not merely a dominion of land, but a dominion of biology. He turned life itself into architecture. His empire expanded not through armies, but through generations, through the unseen empire of the womb. Each birth in those dark years was a conquest repeated, each child a border redrawn. The Mongol state has long since dissolved, yet millions of its descendants still live as quiet continuations of that system, proof that even cruelty can outlive its authors when it becomes structure. But that is only half the story. The other half belongs to the women who carried it forward, the unwilling architects of continuity. Their bodies bore the empire's ambitions, but their endurance gave rise to something beyond its survival, as rebellion, memory, as inheritance. The ledgers that once recorded their names are gone, the scrolls turn to dust. Yet their legacy endures not in ink, but in resonance, in the songs that refuse to die, in the faces that blend histories once thought irreconcilable, in the children who became the unwitting bridge between conqueror and conquered. We often speak of evolution as triumph, but evolution also remembers grief. Each of us is a mosaic of victories and violations. The blood that connects us to life also connects us to loss. And so the question lingers, what do we owe to what we carry? When science traces lineage, it measures only continuation. But history asks for conscience. It reminds us that the survival of a gene is not the same as the survival of a soul. Perhaps that is why the story of the Mongols unsettles us. It forces us to see inheritance not as purity, but as consequence. To recognize that our existence is built on both creation and destruction, that we are all in some way heirs to someone's sorrow. The empire of blood has no capital now. It has diffused into humanity itself. The very diversity we celebrate today was in part born from the violence we try to forget. And yet there is something miraculous in that paradox, that life persists even when born of devastation, that love music and language can emerge from systems built to silence them. The Mongols believed heaven had chosen them to shape the world. Perhaps they were half right, for what they reshaped was not geography but genealogy. They rewrote what it means to belong. Their empire ended with a burial under moonlight, but their pulse still moves beneath a steady, complex, undeniable. We feel it in our shared ancestry, in the strange familiarity of distant faces, in the rhythm that unites every human heartbeat. The lesson endures. No empire truly dies when it learns to live inside its victims. But neither does it win when its legacy becomes memory instead of obedience. And so we arrive at the quiet truth. The conquest is over. The counting is done. The scrolls have turned to dust. What remains is us. Every birth, every song, every heartbeat is a continuation of stories older than nations, stories that began in violence but survived through care. The empire of Genghis Khan may be gone, but its pulse, the fusion of creation and cruelty, still hums softly through our blood, reminding us how history is never buried, only absorbed. So as you listen to the echoes of this story, ask yourself, when history lives within us in the marrow and the memory, what will we choose to carry forward, its conquest or its compassion? The legacy beneath our skin. Lessons from the empire that never died. Every empire leaves ruins, but Genghis Khan left something far more enduring: people. Not monuments of stone or declarations of faith, but millions of living, breathing descendants who carry his mark in their cells. His empire collapsed centuries ago, yet its heartbeat continues through DNA humming quietly in one of every 200 men alive today. That fact alone is astonishing and unsettling. It reminds us that history's consequences do not end when the chronicles close. They continue in us, through us, in the unseen architecture of inheritance. The Mongol story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that greatness and brutality, creation and destruction often share the same bloodstream. The empire of the womb. The idea that domination could be achieved through birth rather than battle, reveals how power can disguise itself as order, as progress, as destiny. What began as conquest became system, and what began as violation became lineage. But if this history teaches us anything, it is that even when power claims the body, it cannot fully own the spirit. The Mongol administrators counted every woman and child as units of value, but the women turned memory into rebellion. They sang songs that outlived the scribes, whispered names that no archive could erase. They carved stories into bone and melody until those stories became part of the landscape itself. Their quiet defiance, acts of love, remembrance, and endurance became the truest resistance of all. That is the first lesson for us. Survival is not passive, it is creative. It builds where destruction tried to erase. Whether we are repairing a broken world or healing a broken heart, endurance itself is a form of authorship. The second lesson lies in our relationship with history. We are quick to celebrate legacy, but rarely do we ask what kind of legacy we are perpetuating. Genghis Khan's biological success came at the cost of human catastrophe. His name survives in millions of descendants, but so too do the echoes of those who suffered under his empire. Our inheritance as a species is always dual, a blend of light and shadow. To understand that complexity is to mature as moral beings. The third lesson concerns power. Evil rarely looks monstrous while it operates. It looks organized. It hides behind paperwork, procedure, and justification. The Mongol scribes, like so many bureaucrats through history, believed they were serving efficiency. But the line between management and moral blindness is always thin. We must learn to question systems that value productivity over empathy, data over dignity, order over life. And finally, this story reminds us that memory is the truest form of freedom. The empire tried to erase its victims, but they continued in song, in myth, and in the quiet persistence of love. We too live in a world of archives and algorithms that threaten to flatten the human soul into information. Remembering the cost of forgetting, remembering the people behind the numbers is our responsibility. Empires rise and fall, but their patterns remain. Beneath the noise of history, the same heartbeat persists, the struggle between domination and compassion, between forgetting and remembrance. The empire fell, but its pulse remains beneath our skin. The question is no longer how history shaped us, but how we will shape what comes next. Will we continue the conquest or choose to carry forward the song, "Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight"? Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.